Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Mississippi. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comment the exact time and location you are watching this narration. In the spring of 1845, the prosperous river town of Natchez stood as a monument to cotton wealth and southern gentility, its grand mansions presiding over carefully manicured grounds where magnolia trees perfumed the humid air. Among these estates sat the Ashford plantation, home to Mrs. Cordelia Ashford, a widow whose purchasing patterns at the local slave markets had begun to trouble even the hardened auctioneers who facilitated such transactions. 7 enslaved individuals acquired over 7 years, each one disappearing from the plantation records within 6 months, their deaths attributed to various maladies and accidents that seemed statistically impossible. The pattern would remain largely unnoticed until a single torn page from a diary surfaced decades later, revealing a systematic horror that defied comprehension. The discovery that would eventually expose this darkness came not during the antebellum period itself, but 78 years after the final death, when a graduate student named Thomas Whitmore arrived at the Mississippi Department of Archives in the autumn of 1923 to conduct research on plantation economics for his dissertation at Tulane University. Working through ledgers and transaction records preserved in the climate-controlled basement of the archive building, Whitmore noticed an anomaly in the Ashford estate's purchasing documentation that initially seemed unremarkable given the era's brutal realities. 7 separate slave acquisitions spanning from January 1838 through March 1845, each transaction meticulously documented with bills of sale, auction house receipts, and county registration papers, followed by death certificates filed with the Adams County Clerk's office within 6 months of purchase. Whitmore's initial notes, preserved among his personal papers, donated to Tulane's special collections in 1967, revealed that he first dismissed this pattern as unfortunate but statistically plausible, writing that mortality rates among enslaved populations were tragically elevated throughout the antebellum South due to disease, inadequate nutrition, and the general brutality of the institution itself, making such concentrated deaths within a single household regrettable, yet not necessarily indicative of deliberate harm. The chronological narrative begins in the bitter cold of January 1838, when Cordelia Ashford, widow of plantation owner Edmund Ashford, who had succumbed to yellow fever during the previous summer's epidemic, traveled alone to Charleston, South Carolina, to attend one of the city's largest slave auctions. The auction records, preserved in the Charleston Historical Society's archives and photographed by researchers in 1951, document the purchase of a young woman identified only as Sarah, described in the auctioneer's notes as approximately 19 years of age, healthy in appearance, and previously employed in domestic service at a defunct plantation near Savannah, Georgia. The bill of sale, dated January 14, 1838, indicates that Mrs. Ashford paid $420 for Sarah, a price considered moderate for a domestic servant of that age and apparent capability. What distinguishes this transaction from thousands of similar purchases made throughout the antebellum South was the deliberateness with which Mrs. Ashford, according to testimony later provided by the auction house manager in an 1846 deposition regarding unrelated business matters, inquired specifically about Sarah's family connections, expressing particular satisfaction upon learning that the young woman had been sold away from her mother and siblings years earlier and possessed no known relatives in Mississippi or the surrounding states. The Ashford plantation itself occupied a peculiar position in the social geography of Adams County, situated 3 miles southeast of Natchez proper, along a secluded bend in the Mississippi River, where ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss created a canopy so dense that the main house remained shrouded in shadow even during midday hours. The property, comprising approximately 800 acres of cotton fields and woodland, was accessible only by a single unpaved road that wound through swampland and stood frequently impassable during the winter months, when heavy rains transformed the clay soil into treacherous mud. Neighbors who lived on adjacent properties, their observations recorded in diaries and correspondence discovered decades later, would recall that Mrs. Ashford seemed unusually determined to maintain the estate's isolation following her husband's death, declining social invitations and discouraging visitors with a coldness that contrasted sharply with the hospitality expected of Southern women of her social standing. The fragmentary reconstruction of Sarah's time at the Ashford plantation emerges primarily from the personal diary of Mrs. Margaret Thornton, whose property bordered the Ashford estate to the north, and whose daily observations, discovered in a trunk in her great-granddaughter's attic in 1945, provide the only contemporary account of life within that isolated household during the early months of 1838. Mrs. Thornton's entries from late January through March make no mention of the Ashford property, suggesting that Sarah's arrival went unnoticed by the neighboring family, but her April 12th notation records seeing a young Negro woman working in the vegetable gardens behind the main house, tending to the early spring planting of beans and squash with what Mrs. Thornton described as mechanical efficiency. Subsequent entries from late April and throughout May document Mrs. Thornton's growing concern regarding this woman's appearance, noting on May 8th that the girl appeared considerably thinner than when first observed, and on May 23rd that she moved with visible difficulty, as though weakened by illness or inadequate nourishment. The most haunting entry, recorded on the night of June 15, 1838, describes how Mrs. Thornton, unable to sleep due to the oppressive heat, stood on her upstairs gallery near midnight and observed a figure at one of the Ashford mansion's third-floor windows, a woman whose hands were pressed flat against the glass in what appeared to be a gesture of desperate longing, or perhaps an attempt to signal for help across the darkness that separated the two properties. Mrs. Thornton noted that the figure remained at the window for several minutes before disappearing back into the unlit interior of the house. By early July, Mrs. Thornton's diary entries contain no further mention of seeing anyone working in the Ashford gardens or moving about the grounds. The death certificate filed with the Adams County Clerk on July 22, 1838, lists Sarah's cause of death as consumption, that catch-all diagnosis for wasting diseases that ravaged the antebellum South, though notably the document contains no physician's signature or notation of medical examination, only Mrs. Ashford's own attestation regarding the circumstances of death. The narrative leaps forward 116 years to the spring of 1954, when a Mississippi State Highway Department construction crew working to expand Route 61 south of Natchez encountered an unexpected obstacle in a densely wooded section of land that had once formed the western boundary of the Ashford plantation. On the morning of March 17th, a bulldozer operator named James Crawford halted his machinery after unearthing what he initially believed to be animal bones, but quickly recognized as human skeletal remains scattered among the roots of an ancient water oak tree. The discovery prompted an immediate work stoppage and the summoning of local authorities, who in turn contacted the Mississippi Department of Archives and History to provide archaeological expertise for what appeared to be an unmarked burial ground containing multiple interments. Dr. Helen Morrison, an archaeologist from the University of Mississippi who had recently completed pioneering work on slave cemetery documentation, arrived at the site 3 days later to conduct a systematic excavation of the area. Her field notes, preserved in the university's anthropology department archives, document the careful exhumation of 7 distinct burial sites arranged in an irregular pattern within a 20-foot radius, each grave shallow and hastily prepared, containing remains that showed no evidence of coffins or burial shrouds. The forensic examination conducted over the following weeks, while limited by the technological constraints of mid-century archaeological science, revealed disturbing commonalities among all 7 sets of remains. Each skeleton displayed markers consistent with severe and prolonged malnutrition, including porous bone tissue, evidence of scurvy, and developmental abnormalities suggesting sustained dietary deficiency during the final months of life. Most significantly, Dr. Morrison's detailed skeletal analysis identified unusual grooves and stress fractures on the wrist and ankle bones of 5 of the 7 individuals, markings that her report, published in the Journal of Southern Archaeology in 1955, characterized as consistent with prolonged physical restraint using metal shackles or chains. The subsequent investigation into land ownership records, conducted by Adams County historian Robert Fielding, established through deed analysis and property survey maps that this wooded burial ground had stood within the boundaries of the Ashford estate during the antebellum period. The chronological narrative returns to the Ashford plantation in March 1839, 13 months after Sarah's death, when Mrs. Cordelia Ashford traveled to New Orleans to attend a slave auction held at the St. Louis Hotel, one of the city's premier venues for such transactions. The surviving records from this auction, maintained in the notarial archives of Orleans Parish, document her purchase of a man identified as Jacob, approximately 25 years of age, described in the auctioneer's catalogue as a field hand of considerable strength who had been brought south from a failing tobacco plantation in Louisa County, Virginia. Mrs. Ashford paid $680 for Jacob, a sum reflecting both his age and his apparent physical capabilities, and transported him back to Mississippi aboard a riverboat that arrived in Natchez on March 24, 1839. 5 months later, on August 19, 1839, the Adams County Clerk's Office received a notification of Jacob's death, the cause listed as dysentery, that common and deadly intestinal affliction that claimed countless lives throughout the antebellum South, particularly during the brutal heat of late summer, when contaminated water and poor sanitation created ideal conditions for such diseases to flourish. 7 months after Jacob's death, in February 1840, Mrs. Ashford attended an estate sale in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where the liquidation of a bankrupt plantation's assets included the auction of 23 enslaved individuals. She purchased a young woman named Ruth, age 22, who had previously worked as a house servant, paying $490 according to the bill of sale preserved in the East Baton Rouge Parish archives. Ruth's tenure at the Ashford estate lasted precisely 5 months, ending with her death on July 16, 1840, officially attributed to injuries sustained in a fall down the main staircase of the plantation house, the death certificate noting a fractured skull as the immediate cause of mortality. What emerges from the documentary record of these transactions is a pattern not only of death but of deliberate geographic dispersion in Mrs. Ashford's purchasing behavior, each acquisition made through a different auction house in a different city, suggesting a calculated effort to prevent any single slave trader or auctioneer from recognizing the disturbing frequency with which her purchases resulted in mortality. The introduction of Dr. Amos Caldwell into the narrative comes through a collection of personal correspondence discovered in 1967 by his great-great-grandson, a postal worker in Jackson, Mississippi, who found a cache of letters wrapped in oilcloth inside a leather medical bag stored in his grandmother's attic trunk. Among these yellow documents was a particularly revealing letter dated October 23, 1841, addressed to Dr. Benjamin Marchant, a fellow physician practicing in New Orleans, whom Caldwell had known since their shared medical training at the University of Pennsylvania in the 1820s. The letter, now preserved in the Mississippi Medical History Collection at the University of Mississippi Medical Center, begins with routine professional inquiries before shifting to a matter that evidently weighed heavily on Caldwell's conscience. He writes that he has been retained by a local widow, whom he doesn't name directly, but whose identity researchers have conclusively established as Mrs. Cordelia Ashford through cross-referencing with estate payment records to provide death certificates for enslaved individuals on her property. What troubled Dr. Caldwell, as he confides to his distant colleague, was not the deaths themselves, which were unfortunately common enough in a society built upon the brutal institution of slavery, but rather the peculiar circumstances surrounding his involvement. He notes that he was never summoned to attend these individuals during their illnesses, never permitted to examine them while they retained any spark of life, but was instead called only after death had already occurred, shown bodies already growing cold, and asked to provide medical certification based solely on Mrs. Ashford's descriptions of symptoms and the appearance of the deceased. The letter continues with Dr. Caldwell's admission that he attempted, after the third such death certificate, to decline further involvement in these matters, suggesting that Mrs. Ashford engage another physician for such services. However, he was persuaded to continue through what he euphemistically describes as both generous financial arrangements that significantly supplemented his income and certain considerations regarding his professional standing in Natchez society, a veiled reference that suggests Mrs. Ashford possessed some form of leverage or influence that made refusal imprudent. In November 1841, Mrs. Cordelia Ashford traveled north along the Mississippi River to Vicksburg, where the bankruptcy proceedings of the Westmoreland plantation had resulted in a court-ordered auction of all assets, including 37 enslaved individuals who would be sold to satisfy creditor claims against the estate. The Vicksburg Daily Sentinel, in its edition of November 19, 1841, published a notice of the upcoming sale that included descriptions of the enslaved people to be auctioned, among them a man named Daniel, approximately 30 years of age, identified as a skilled carpenter capable of fine joinery work and furniture construction. The newspaper account, preserved in the archives of the Mississippi State Historical Society, noted that Daniel appeared in excellent health and possessed valuable skills that would command premium pricing. Mrs. Ashford purchased Daniel for $750, the highest price she had yet paid for any enslaved individual, a sum reflecting both his age, his robust physical condition, and his specialized carpentry abilities. The documentation of Daniel's brief time at the Ashford estate comes not from personal correspondence or diary entries, but rather from a more mundane source discovered quite by accident during a 1978 survey of historic commercial buildings in downtown Natchez. Researchers examining the records of Pemberton's Hardware and Dry Goods, a mercantile establishment that operated continuously from 1829 until 1891, found ledger books detailing customer purchases arranged chronologically by date. The entry for December 8, 1841, records a substantial order placed by Mrs. C. Ashford, consisting of 6 sets of iron manacles, 4 heavy padlocks of the type typically used for securing storage buildings or livestock enclosures, and 30 feet of chain links with a tensile strength suitable for restraining large animals, or, as the ledger's notation chillingly suggests, other purposes requiring secure confinement. Daniel's death certificate, filed with the Adams County Clerk on April 3, 1842, attributes his demise to brain fever, that vague 19th-century diagnosis encompassing various forms of encephalitis, meningitis, or severe delirium, though Dr. Caldwell's signature appears notably shaky compared to his normally precise medical hand. The testimony of Samuel Pritchard enters the historical record through an unlikely avenue, appearing in a legal deposition dated March 12, 1846, taken as part of a boundary dispute between two neighboring plantation owners in Adams County, a mundane property disagreement that required testimony from individuals familiar with land usage patterns in the area during previous years. Pritchard, who had worked as an overseer at the Ashford estate for approximately 7 months during 1842, before accepting a position at a larger plantation near Woodville, was called to provide information regarding the western boundary markers of the Ashford property and the location of certain access roads that had existed during his tenure there. The deposition, preserved in the Adams County Chancery Court records and rediscovered during a 1962 legal history research project, contains mostly technical details about property lines and agricultural practices, but includes several paragraphs in which Pritchard describes the unusual management arrangements he encountered while employed by Mrs. Ashford. He stated under oath that he was given explicit and repeated instructions never to enter the main plantation house under any circumstances, not even to deliver reports or receive instructions, all communication with Mrs. Ashford being conducted either on the front gallery of the house or in the estate office, located in a separate building near the Cotton Gin. Furthermore, Pritchard testified that he was forbidden from any interaction whatsoever with the household servants, a prohibition he found exceptionally strange, given that overseers on most plantations maintained at least supervisory contact with all enslaved workers, regardless of their specific duties. Most peculiarly, Pritchard noted that Mrs. Ashford personally supervised all matters relating to the domestic staff, a level of direct involvement highly unusual for a woman of her social standing, and that he had observed her on multiple occasions transporting covered baskets of food from the kitchen house to the main residence herself, bypassing the normal practice of having servants carry meals, a detail that struck him as contradicting every norm of plantation household management he had witnessed during his 20 years working on Mississippi estates. The pattern that had begun with Sarah in 1838 continued with devastating regularity through the next 6 years, and in August 1843, Mrs. Cordelia Ashford traveled to Augusta, Georgia, where she purchased a woman named Grace, aged 27, from a slave trader named Harmon Wexler, who specialized in acquiring enslaved individuals from failed plantations throughout the Georgia-Piedmont region. The bill of sale, preserved among Wexler's business papers, donated to the Georgia Historical Society in 1934, describes Grace as previously employed in fieldwork and domestic service, healthy in constitution, and sold for $530. Grace's death certificate, filed with the Adams County Clerk on January 19, 1844, lists pneumonia as the cause of death, that inflammation of the lungs that proved particularly deadly during Mississippi's damp winter months, when inadequate heating and poor living conditions rendered the afflicted vulnerable to respiratory failure. 5 months after Grace's burial, in June 1844, Mrs. Ashford journeyed to Memphis, Tennessee, to attend an estate liquidation sale where she acquired a man named Samuel, aged 24, who had worked as a blacksmith's assistant at a now-defunct ironworks near Nashville. Samuel survived at the Ashford plantation for approximately 5 months before his death on November 28, 1844. The official cause recorded as complications arising from an untreated wound, though the death certificate provides no details regarding how such an injury was sustained or why it received no medical attention until it proved fatal. The acceleration of this grim sequence did not escape the notice of Thomas Whitmore when, in November 1923, he compiled his research findings in a leather-bound notebook whose pages reveal his growing horror at what the documentary evidence suggested. In notes dated November 14, 1923, Whitmore performed statistical calculations based on mortality data from other Mississippi plantations during the same period, determining that while individual slave deaths occurred with tragic frequency throughout the antebellum South, the probability of 7 consecutive purchases, all resulting in death within 6 months, approached mathematical impossibility, leading him to write in increasingly agitated handwriting that he had uncovered not coincidence or misfortune, but rather documentary evidence of what could only be described as systematic murder. In March 1845, Mrs. Cordelia Ashford returned to Charleston, South Carolina, 7 years after her first purchase in that city, to attend an auction at Ryan's Mart, one of the largest and most notorious slave trading establishments in the antebellum South. Among the individuals offered for sale that day was a young woman named Eliza, aged 20, whose auction catalogue description noted her literacy, refined manners, and previous employment as a lady's maid in the household of Mrs. Catherine Winthrop, a prominent Charleston socialite whose recent death had resulted in the dispersal of her estate and the sale of her domestic staff. Mrs. Ashford purchased Eliza for $620, a price reflecting both the young woman's education and her training in the particular skills required for attending to wealthy white women. The reconstruction of Eliza's life before this fateful purchase comes from an extraordinary cache of letters discovered among the papers of her younger sister's descendants and donated to the Charleston Historical Society in 1989, correspondence that provides a rare and heartbreaking glimpse into the interior life of an enslaved woman facing an uncertain future. In a letter dated January 1845, 2 months before her sale, Eliza wrote to her sister Martha, who remained enslaved on a rice plantation near Georgetown, describing her anxiety about rumors that Mrs. Winthrop's declining health would soon result in the household being dissolved and the servants sold to new owners. Despite her fears, Eliza's letters reveal an intelligent and remarkably hopeful spirit as she expressed confidence in her abilities and faith that her education and skills would ensure placement in a respectable household where she might be treated with some measure of dignity. A subsequent letter from February 1845 describes her interview with various potential purchasers who visited the Winthrop residence before the auction, noting with cautious optimism that she hoped to be purchased by a family in Charleston, where she might remain near familiar surroundings and maintain some connection, however tenuous, to the community where she had spent most of her life. The single most damning piece of evidence in the entire Ashford case came to light not through systematic archival research or archaeological excavation, but through sheer chance during the demolition of the long-abandoned Ashford mansion in the summer of 1932, when a construction worker named Robert Hayes discovered a torn page of what appeared to be a personal diary wedged between 2 floorboards in the 3rd-floor attic of the deteriorating structure. The fragment, measuring approximately 4 inches by 6 inches, bore a date of May 18th, 1845, and contained approximately 200 words written in an increasingly unsteady hand that documented conditions of such deliberate cruelty that Hayes immediately brought it to the attention of local authorities, rather than discarding it as historical debris. The text, preserved in the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, after Hayes donated it in 1933, describes in Eliza's own words how she had been confined to a locked room in the attic from the moment of her arrival at the plantation, given only minimal portions of cornmeal and water, delivered once daily, and subjected to what she termed Mrs. Ashford's examinations, though the fragmentary nature of the surviving text provides no elaboration on what these examinations entailed. Eliza's entries detail her progressive physical deterioration over the span of approximately 2 months, noting the weakness that made standing difficult, the constant hunger that consumed her thoughts, and the isolated terror of imprisonment in a space where her calls for help went unheard or deliberately ignored by anyone who might have intervened. The authenticity of this document was initially questioned by historians who suggested it might be a later fabrication designed to sensationalize the Ashford story. But rigorous forensic analysis conducted in 1958 using paper dating techniques and microscopic ink examination confirmed that both the paper stock and the iron gall ink were consistent with materials commonly available in the 1840s. Furthermore, handwriting analysis comparing the diary fragment with Eliza's pre-sale letters to her sister revealed unmistakable similarities in letter formation, spelling patterns and distinctive flourishes that established beyond reasonable doubt that the same hand had produced both documents. Eliza's death certificate, filed with the Adams County Clerk's Office on August 23, 1845, attributed her demise to a wasting disease, using the same vague medical terminology that had characterized the previous death records, with Dr. Amos Caldwell's signature appearing once again at the bottom of the document, though his handwriting by this point had deteriorated into an almost illegible scrawl that suggested either advancing age or profound moral distress. This seventh death, within 7 years, following a pattern now too obvious to ignore entirely, finally prompted intervention from several prominent members of Natchez society who had begun to view Mrs. Ashford's household with growing suspicion and unease. The dead, minutes from a special meeting of the First Presbyterian Church Board, discovered in 1956 among denominational records stored in the church's basement archive, document that on September 14, 1845, a delegation consisting of Judge Hamilton Pierce, Reverend Charles Whitfield, and Reverend Thomas Mason visited the Ashford estate to express the community's concerns regarding the alarming mortality rate among her enslaved workers. According to the meeting minutes recorded by Church Secretary Mr. Edward Dalton, the delegation reported that Mrs. Ashford received them with perfect composure and gracious hospitality, serving tea and refreshments in her parlor, while addressing their concerns with explanations that, while not entirely satisfying, proved difficult to definitively contradict. She reportedly stated that she had deliberately sought to purchase enslaved individuals who were already in poor health or who had been neglected by previous owners, motivated by Christian charity and a desire to provide comfort during their final months of life, a noble-sounding rationale that reframed her purchasing pattern as humanitarian intervention rather than something more sinister. Mrs. Ashford further explained that despite her best efforts to provide medical care and adequate nutrition, these unfortunate souls had arrived at her plantation already so weakened by previous mistreatment that their deaths, while regrettable, were tragically inevitable. The delegation, lacking any concrete evidence of wrongdoing and constrained by the social conventions that made it difficult to directly accuse a respected white widow of impropriety, found this explanation superficially plausible enough to forestall any official investigation, though the meeting minutes note continuing private reservations among several committee members. The absence of any legal response to the pattern of deaths at the Ashford plantation, despite mounting suspicions within the Natchez community, illuminates the profound structural barriers to justice that characterized the antebellum legal system's treatment of enslaved individuals as property rather than persons deserving legal protection. No formal investigation was ever launched by local authorities. No inquest was convened to examine the circumstances surrounding these deaths, and no criminal charges were brought against Mrs. Cordelia Ashford, despite the statistical improbability of 7 consecutive deaths within such abbreviated time frames. The legal reasoning, or perhaps more accurately, the legal impossibility, behind this inaction is captured with chilling clarity in a letter dated February 9, 1847, written by Natchez attorney Jonathan Merrick to a legal colleague in New Orleans, a piece of correspondence discovered among Merrick's professional papers housed at Tulane University's Law Library archive. Merrick writes that he has been approached by several concerned citizens requesting his assessment of whether any legal action could be pursued against Mrs. Ashford, given the troubling pattern that had become common knowledge throughout Adams County society. His response, spanning 3 closely written pages, provides a meticulous analysis of Mississippi law as it existed in the 1840s, concluding that while the circumstances were morally disturbing and suggestive of deliberate harm, no prosecutable crime could be established under the legal framework that governed relations between slaveholders and enslaved people. Merrick notes that enslaved individuals occupied a peculiar position in Southern jurisprudence, defined as property for most legal purposes, yet occasionally recognized as persons in criminal proceedings, creating contradictions that generally resolved in favor of protecting slaveholder prerogatives. He explains that without eyewitness testimony from credible witnesses, meaning free white citizens willing to testify against another white person of good social standing, and without physical evidence of violence that could be definitively proven rather than merely suspected, no prosecutor could successfully bring charges of murder or manslaughter. Furthermore, Merrick observes that the deaths had been attributed to various natural causes by a licensed physician, creating a documentary record that provided Mrs. Ashford with legal protection regardless of private doubts about the veracity of those medical certifications. Following the events of 1845, Mrs. Cordelia Ashford withdrew increasingly from Natchez society, making no further slave purchases and living in growing seclusion on her isolated plantation, where the gardens gradually returned to wilderness and the cotton fields lay fallow for lack of adequate labor to maintain cultivation. She employed a succession of overseers to manage the reduced agricultural operations and the small number of enslaved workers who remained on the property. But by all accounts, she spent her final decades as a reclusive figure rarely seen beyond the boundaries of her estate, declining invitations to social gatherings and church functions with such consistency that she gradually faded from the active consciousness of Natchez's social elite. Mrs. Ashford died on April 3, 1867, at the age of 62, just 2 years after the conclusion of the Civil War that had demolished the economic and social system within which her alleged crimes had occurred, and her obituary, published in the Natchez Daily Courier on April 5th and preserved in the newspaper archives at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, describes her in terms that seem jarringly disconnected from the pattern of death that had defined her middle years. The obituary characterizes her as a respected member of the community who had endured great personal tragedy, including the loss of her husband to yellow fever and the subsequent challenges of managing a plantation alone during turbulent decades, making no mention whatsoever of the disturbing mortality rates among her enslaved workers. Mrs. Ashford died intestate, having failed to prepare any will or testament despite her considerable property holdings, a circumstance that triggered probate proceedings documented in Adams County Chancery Court records. The estate inventory, compiled by her nephew and appointed executor, Mr. Lawrence Ashford of Vicksburg, listed among her possessions numerous personal journals, correspondence bundles, and private papers spanning several decades of her life, materials that might have provided definitive answers to the questions surrounding the deaths on her property. However, a letter from Lawrence Ashford to his brother, dated June 1867, discovered among family papers in 1971, reveals that he ordered these personal documents burned shortly after inventorying them, stating explicitly his determination to protect the family name from scandals. The synthesis of evidence accumulated across nearly 8 decades of intermittent research, from Thomas Whitmore's initial archival discoveries in 1923 through the archaeological excavations of 1954 and subsequent forensic re-examinations conducted throughout the 1970s and 1980s, creates a composite portrait of systematic cruelty whose full dimensions remain forever incomplete due to the destruction of Mrs. Ashford's personal papers and the inherent limitations of historical reconstruction. The archaeological findings from the unmarked burial ground, when combined with Eliza's diary fragment, Dr. Caldwell's troubled correspondence, the hardware store ledger documenting purchases of chains and restraints, and the various witness testimonies preserved in legal depositions and personal diaries, establish beyond reasonable doubt that the 7 individuals purchased by Mrs. Cordelia Ashford between 1838 and 1845 died not from the natural causes listed on their death certificates, but rather as a result of deliberate deprivation, confinement, and abuse that transformed her isolated plantation house into a site of prolonged suffering. Forensic anthropologists from Louisiana State University, who conducted detailed skeletal analysis in 1976 using techniques unavailable to earlier investigators, concluded that all 7 sets of remains displayed markers consistent with severe and sustained malnutrishment over periods of several months, along with bone stress patterns suggesting physical restraint in the final weeks of life. Yet despite the accumulation of circumstantial evidence and the undeniable pattern of death, the fundamental question of motivation remains unanswered and perhaps unanswerable, given the absence of any confession, detailed eyewitness account, or surviving documentation that might explain why a wealthy widow systematically purchased and killed 7 human beings over the course of 7 years. Scholars who have studied the case have proposed various theories ranging from sadistic psychological compulsion to some form of delusional belief, to possibilities too disturbing to articulate in academic prose, but the truth died with Mrs. Ashford in 1867 and was consumed by the flames that destroyed her journals. In May 2003, following decades of advocacy by local historians and descendants of enslaved communities, the 7 sets of remains were removed from storage and transported to Natchez for proper burial in the city cemetery, where a granite memorial marker now stands, bearing an inscription that reads, "In memory of 7 souls, names unknown, victims of violence, in the years 1838 to 1845, their stories stolen but not forgotten."